the conversation increasingly becomes dominated by lunatics. And I don't think that's representative of most Americans. And there's also this problem of lumping in everyone together in like this neat little box of ideology, right? So I think in the minds of a lot of people on the left, you are the exact same person as Tucker Carlson, right? And I think you're different. I think you're different from Matt Walsh. I think you're different from Candace Owens.
We watched the first half of this yesterday. Let's just pick up where we left off, shall we?
Left media.
Yep, that's loud. That's loud, all right. Yep, that's, let's go down to here.
They're getting one perspective and they're not hearing from the other side at all. And when they do hear from the other side, they're hearing from the extremes saying insane, lunatic stuff. And they think that that's representative of everyone on the right. And I don't think that's necessarily true.
We'll get to more on that in just 1 second. First, let's say that you are face down with woke capitalism. How would you respond? Well, we here at Daily Wire, we actually launched Jeremy's Razors to fight back against the predations of companies that hate your guts but take your money. If one of your goals this year is to do that kind of thing, to do business with the company.
Move along.
So let's go back to national politics for a second, since we've done our bit on local politics. We mostly cover national politics. So, you know, when you look at the current state of the parties, it looks like the Democrats are in a state of strength, obviously. The Republican Party has been in a significant state of disarray for quite a while.
It's funny you say that.
I was about to say, I think that that's actually masking a lot of divisions underneath the surface in the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party has sort of an eggshell skull. I think right now, because the Republican Party decided to raid the local homeless shelter for their candidates, the Democrats have been shielded from the consequences of their own bad issue choice and some fairly bad candidates of their own, ranging from people who literally had strokes in the middle of a campaign to a president who does not seem capable of carrying out his office. I'm going to ask you to diagnose the Republican Party in a second and which direction you think that Republican Party is going to go. And then we can get into where we really disagree, because we've been doing too much agreeing so far. But you know, if you're diagnosing the Democratic Party, what's the direction you think the Democratic Party needs to move? And can Joe Biden be the guy who leads them there, or who else is there? Because that seems like kind of a thin bench.
Well, Ben, I think we're going to start disagreeing right away because I think the only winning direction for the Democratic Party is in the direction of FDR. And that's the reason why in the beginning of Biden's term, his team tried to paint him as like the new FDR. But I mean, he couldn't be further from the truth. I got to be honest, right? Like the good provisions within Build Back Better died. He didn't even fight for them. I don't even think he actually wanted those provisions to pass. I think it was all for show. Look, the most important thing, in my opinion, is to take care of Americans, make sure they're thriving, protect workers, protect consumers. That is my focus. I think people want to live in safe communities, clean communities. I don't think it makes you some crazy, rabid right-winger to want that. I think everyone wants that, and they need to be honest about it, right? So for Democrats, stop focusing on scaring people about the scary right-wing candidates and offer them real solutions that you're going to fight for. I think that's the only long-lasting winning strategy for Democrats. Are they going to do it? No, because they're captured by the money. There's too many. And you're right, what you said earlier about incentives and disincentives, that's the whole game, Ben, okay? Trying to decipher whether a politician is a good guy or a bad guy is nonsense. Are the incentives there to ensure that this elected official is actually going to be honest and work on behalf of his or her constituents? That's the real question. And right now, I think all the incentives are in the wrong place.
So what's the number one policy you'd like to see the Democratic Party pursue? You're a legislator now. You've been elected president. What's your first initiative as president of the United States?
I mean, you couldn't do this unilaterally, but I think one of the main policies that would improve a lot of these other issues that we're talking about is healthcare. Single-payer healthcare, or at least, in the very least, in the short term, just reform healthcare to a point where everyone has the coverage they need to get the care they need. So the untreated mental illnesses that we're seeing on our streets right now, that is a byproduct of a broken healthcare system. I want to fix that. That would be, again, the number one thing I would focus on if I had the power to really make that change.
So, I mean, obviously, I think that we all see the problems with the healthcare system. It's sort of a weird Frankensteinian monster, this sort of private public monster in which Virtually all medical care in the United States is publicly subsidized at some level by Medicare, Medicaid, by hospital reimbursements that are involved with local and state regulation. The levels of regulatory thickets and the amount of administration, the administrative cost for healthcare in the United States is extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. And I think that the big problem with healthcare is
not
that
nearly as necessary as people believe it is.
Now that no matter which side you come at it from, you are going to get wrecked for even poking a stick into it. Right? The minute you poke a stick at it, ooze comes out. Because if you come at it from my side of the aisle, which is it needs more privatization, we should get rid of the connection between your employment. I mean, if I were coming at this tabula rasa, you get rid of the connection between your employment and your healthcare. It's absurd. Why is your employer paying for your healthcare in the first place? Right? You should.
Well, how would people? So look, I agree with you on that. I think a single-payer system would do away with the need for employers
here we go.
Provide coverage for their employees. I actually hate the system where, if you're working at a place that you might despise and you want to move on, or maybe you want to start your own business, right? You're less willing to do it if your healthcare is reliant on you staying at the company you hate so much.
Right.
I think it's actually stifled a lot of economic growth. I think there would be a lot more small businesses, successful small businesses,
way more.
People had that freedom to just walk away knowing that they wouldn't lose their health coverage as a result. You get what I'm saying?
No, first of all, I totally agree with you. I think that's why I would prefer to go back to individual and community-based insurance. Right? This is why the lack of social fabric really is a problem, because in my vision of a perfect healthcare world, essentially because you know your neighbors and you know your community, and you don't want your neighbors to die, your community helps subsidize your healthcare. But I have very serious doubts about the national community subsidizing healthcare at a large scale, because I don't know that person in New York. I don't know what their habits are. I don't know what incentives they have to engage in the healthcare structure. And you do see a wide variety of sort of models that have been used, right? Singapore is a much more privatized healthcare system than, for example, Great Britain. So there are a bunch of different ways to sort of slice this particular issue.
Yeah, you know what's interesting, because we hear a lot of, I feel like the right wing in America puts words in the mouths of Canadians and people living in Great Britain when it comes to their health insurance, policy, and their nationalized health care. But you talk to them, and
the problem also is, like, I can understand that Ben's like, why am I paying for healthcare if I'm living in Florida of somebody in New York? And the very simple answer is, like, because you live in the same country and because you should care about people. You're both Americans. Like it doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter what state they live in. It shouldn't matter if they live in your neighborhood or the neighborhood down the street or the neighborhood in the next state. Like, on a fundamental level, we should care about America's overall health, health and everybody in its health, just on the basis of them being Americans. Because no matter what, as many barriers as you can put up between, like, but they make more money than me, or they're like, they might not need the help from me, or they might think this thing is like necessary. I don't think Ben would probably say, like, I don't want my money going to trans care. Well, guess what? Trans people are also Americans. The person who's in some other state that you're not aware of, everyone in the South, I don't live in the South. Fuck the South. The South is some shit. But I want healthcare for them because they're Americans. They live in America. They're American citizens. That's it. That's the lowest possible bar. And that's why I think the bar needs to be set that low, because you need to have it available to the broadest definition of people in this country, to which that would be Americans. Like, and also you would much more easily be able to leverage that access against those corporations when it comes to bargaining and negotiating. If you're living in like some small town community who rallies together, guess what? Any health insurer, any hospital outsizes you so much, and you as a community are dependent on that hospital. You don't have nearly as much leverage as you think you do. But an entire country, you absolutely do. An entire state, you absolutely do. So
they seem to love it. So I'll give you an example. So when Boris Johnson was running again for prime minister, what was really interesting is how he kept emphasizing the need to bolster.
Oh, it's a third rail there. You can't touch it.
But it's a third rail because of how much the people living there love their healthcare system. And so there's there's freedom that comes along with that. You know, when you consider the fact that our life expectancy in the United States is comparable to that of Cuba's, there's something broken in our system.
Well, I mean, so first of all, I mean, whenever we get into these sorts of discussions, you have to start looking at apples to apples comparisons in terms of the demographics of the United States, our age, the ethnic composition of the United States, because different ethnicities actually have different health problems disproportionately. You have to look at the poverty rate in different areas. Obviously, the life expectancy in Vermont is significantly higher than life expectancy in, say, Alabama, and so that is a wide gap that is not really attributable necessarily to healthcare quality, because again, the same national system applies to both Vermont and Alabama. So you have to, the United States is also a country of 340 million people. Cuba is a country of significantly fewer people. So I mean, all of these, this is why I sort of object to any attempt to use Norwegian models and apply them to a significantly.
Wait, but that wouldn't matter though. It doesn't matter. As long as you're leveraging an entire society, the larger your society, the more bargaining power you're going to have. Like, I've heard people say this where they're like, oh, but they're like a smaller country. They can like afford that. We're a bigger country. We're a much larger country with a much larger economy. Like, it scales. See, that's the thing. Like the healthcare costs will scale. We can easily scale for size in these cases. Like, it's why we have measurements per capita or measurements per like, you know, X number of citizens or whatever in any given area. Like, you can scale this stuff very easily.
More diverse, heterogeneous, and large country.
Well, okay, so let me get into that, because if you look at what's worked, because Cuba, I mean, obviously incredibly poor country, especially with embargoes and all of that.
That the U.S. has placed on
them, terror, which led to other countries feeling very uncomfortable doing any business with Cuba. So its healthcare system is severely under-resourced. But what they've done correctly is they've focused most of their energy on preventative care, because preventative care is less costly than just allowing people to get super sick. At that point, you know, whatever illness they have is a lot more costly to deal with. So they're like, all right, we don't have the resources. We just got to make sure we really hone in on preventative care. That's worked out really well for them. Whereas in the United States, people aren't getting the preventative care they need to prevent severe illnesses because it's so costly, right? So we need to do something.
Well, I mean, first we should tell people to stop eating so much. I mean, the United States is an extraordinarily fat country. I mean, by the stats, we're a very fat country. I mean, you compare us to Cuba, you compare us to anywhere in Scandinavia.
Also, our food quality is also shit. And the way that we've been socialized to consume like food is has also driven a lot of people into obesity and into what's the word I'm looking for, like weight adjacent or weight I will just go adjacent weight adjacent diseases. It's also, we don't have like a thriving like, what's it called, you go into any town, there's not really also like a thriving like public area. There's not as many I think like parks and other kind of community activities that I feel like we used to have back in the day, that they just don't pop up as often. I like, there's also that aspect, but this is an aspect to it. Our relationship with food in this country is really toxic, but a big aspect of that is the ingredients and also the additives that a lot of these food manufacturers are putting into their food. People are addicted to the food that they're eating in a way that we don't see in other countries, because they've regulated their food processing processes.
Yeah, this is a country that has, I mean, this is why during COVID, people would say 40% of the population has pre-existing health problems. And meanwhile, Sweden's like, let her rip, man, we're all in great shape. But it's, you know, so again, comparing apples to oranges is a very difficult thing. When it comes to the NHS or Canada, the only pushback that I give there is that you'd be hard-pressed to find a government-provided universal system of any sort that is widely disparaged by the people who benefit from it. Meaning that if you have no available alternative, people who are on food stamps like the food stamp system, people who are on welfare like the welfare system, people who get student loans like the student loan system, people who get government-subsidized mortgages like the government-subsidized mortgage system.
Wait, but that's not true. In the United States, people only have the option of private health care until they're 65, and people fucking hate it. if that was true, if people didn't know there was an alternative, then they would fucking love the healthcare system that they have. But it's become very clear, especially in the last couple of years, that Americans fucking hate our healthcare system. It's awful. It's predatory.
Once you make people dependent, which is why in the United States, as I say, anytime you poke the status quo from either side, you get penalized, right? People will say, I hate my healthcare, and then the minute somebody tries to screw with their healthcare, they're like, God, we got to go after them.
I mean, I think Medicare is a good example of that. So is Social Security.
It is.
I mean,
they're both going to be insolvent, but that's.
I don't think that's necessarily true.
We'll have to raise taxes pretty dramatically, or lower benefits, or lower the retirement age.
I mean,
which is really what we should
I think you're going to hate me for saying this, but I think the cap on Social Security taxes should be lifted entirely.
Oh, no, I'm not. By the way, that is at least an ideologically consistent position.
Yeah.
Meaning that if you are going to say that we need to maintain Social Security as it currently stands, as a defined outcome plan, as opposed to a defined contributions plan, then of course you're going to have to raise taxes.
Right.
I mean, like, I'll say that, I have more, it is a more honest argument to say that we want Scandinavian-style welfare systems, so we need Scandinavian-style taxes, than the lie that is currently being pursued by both sides, I will say, that we have to spend exorbitant amounts of money and never pay for it under any circumstances, and then just basically bet that the bill will never come due.
Right.
So if you say raise Social Security tax, I'm like, okay, fine, that's an argument we can make, right? Because what I object to is you'll say raise Social Security taxes to pay for Social Security, and I'll say I don't want that to happen. That's a good debate. What I object to is if I'll say, listen, in order for Social Security to maintain, you're going to have to go to austerity measures. You're going to have to cut the age of retirement because people are living longer. You're going to have to you're going to have to raise taxes. And the person on the other side will say, none of that's true. It's like, no, one of those things has to be true.
But yeah,
right?
but see, that's what I'm talking about. Just going back to our conversation earlier, determining the difference between a good faith or bad faith individual and whether or not you.
Also, by the way, like, let's talk about this. Like, Ben's over here like, oh, increase austerity measures, which means put more pressure on workers, more pressure on average Americans, raise the retirement age. That means Americans are going to be working longer. Like, in what world, in what functioning system would it make sense that we created Social Security in, I believe, like the 1940s, if I remember correctly? I want to say it's like early 40s, right? I could be wrong, but less than 100 years ago, we created Social Security, right? We created Medicare and all these systems to ensure that when people are at a certain age of retirement, that they're able to enjoy the second half of their life as they've, since they worked the entire first half, usually more than the first half. I mean, we're talking quite a bit of work years. And the idea of telling people, hey, back in like the 60s, your parents retired like in their 50s and spent the next 20 to 40 years just kind of hanging out, being able to live their like live a little bit more of a free life, living in dignity in their older age. Meanwhile, you fast forward to 2023 and what? You're now like, somebody my age, 30, I have to wait until I'm 70. I get less time. How is it that we've grown as a country? How is it that we've expanded our economic reach? How is it we've become more wealthy, more productive? All of these things, people have gotten more rich in that time. And you're telling me that we can't afford as a country to afford people of my age when it's time to retire? An actually decent retirement length? Like, we've regressed in this case. We created this program that is wonderful, that gives people a dignified retirement, and we have slowly pulled it back and pulled it back and pulled it back. It is now less attainable for more people if we go down Ben's route. Now, I understand that Ben's like, oh, it's a thing that, that's one of the things you might have to do. But I fail to see how we failed as a country since the 1940s, since the 1950s, to the point where we are reducing the quality of benefits. Meanwhile, I've been paying the same money that my grandparents were paying. I've been paying the same money that my parents have been paying. Now, tell me how that system is supposed to work. We talk about fair systems. Like what? I put in the same amount of money that they do, but I get less retirement. No, fuck that. Fund it. Now, how you do so is also incredibly important. Obviously, raising taxes on regular people is probably going to be part of that, but the lion's share of that needs to come from different sources, to which you would go after corporate taxes, you'd go after stocks, you'd go after other ways of generating that revenue in tax dollars, because a lot of these corpos and a lot of these organizations have found new ways to create revenues for themselves. So that's also how you would do that.
Debate with that individual.
That's one argument to how you would do that.
This is exactly a perfect example. You're being honest, and you're at least acknowledging, the flaws from the bad faith people, the inconsistencies from bad faith. Like, why even engage in a debate with someone who's inconsistent, isn't honest about what they really want? So I just wanted to go back to that conversation, because it's a perfect example of what I mean.
And I think this also ties back into,
and
again, that
good
localism
faith
conversation
Andy
that we were having before.
Yeah.
We'll get into that in just 1 second. First, let's talk about the...
Holy shit. They have a lot of fucking ads. Jesus.
One of the things that I've said many times when it comes to economics is that I'm a communist in my own house, and I'm a high-level capitalist when it comes to the greater areas of elevation.
Mm-hmm.
So the further you get out from my local community, the more capitalistic and free market-oriented I am. In my house, I have a joint bank account with my wife.
Mm-hmm.
Right? My wife earns significantly less money than I do. It does not matter. It is both of our money, right? Which is what we tell our kids. It's not daddy earning the money. It's our family earning the money, and our family is communist because we're a family. But I'm not going to be a communist
the means of production
over in North Dakota. That's not my job. Right? I don't know.
Also, I'm not sure how much of that is communism as much as it is collectivism, but okay.
Well, that person, I love my family more than I love that person, and anybody who tells you they don't love their family more than they love Rando is lying to you. It's just not true. And so what that means is that social solidarity has to be the predicate for any policy. And ironically, what's been happening is that as social solidarity breaks down, people want more control at the top level of government to try to create an ersatz social solidarity. And that's not going to happen. It's going to make the problem significantly worse. So if you argued to me in my local religious community, right, my local synagogue where I'm Orthodox, which means that in my community, there are 300 families in our synagogue. We all know each other. We go over to each other's houses. We babysit each other's kids. If you said to us, we're going to have a synagogue-subsidized national healthcare single-payer program, I'd be like, okay, that's worth arguing about. Like, I'm definitely willing to have that conversation. I know all you people. I trust you people. I trust you're not going to be a free rider on the system and take advantage of the system because I know you. And
this is also the problem. This is what I'm also going to say. People who do I don't trust you, I don't know you, da-da-da-da-da. I think this is where the fundamental, breakdown comes, where I don't really have a better way of saying this. This is called living in a society. And it's called living in a community that's larger than the one that you can see with your eyes. If you believe in American ideals, if you believe in America as a concept, you should easily be able to think of every American, whether they take more or take less, as equal to you. Not saying you gotta care about them, not saying you gotta have some kind of personal connection. But an issue I have with people is a lot of times we're so ready to pick apart, criticize, judge those who we think we are helping. Have you ever have you ever known somebody who they look at a homeless person and they will vocalize to you, don't give them money, they're just going to spend it on drugs, on alcohol, on whatever it might be. Do you want to know where that comes from? That comes from a bit of a fragile ego. Because a lot of times people think, I worked hard for this, let's say $5. If I give this person $5 and they don't do the thing that I think they should do, I've been taken advantage of, I've been duped, I've been wronged. And I don't think that that's a healthy mindset to go about looking at other people. We all are flawed. We are all not going to be the person that everybody else wants us to be all the time. But I do think there is value in trusting your fellow man and not letting your ego, your desire to not be made a fool in your mind, get in the way of helping somebody. And I get it. You're like, oh, but like, what if they don't use it for anything meaningful? That's okay. That wasn't the point of you helping that person. That wasn't the point of you reaching out and offering them some empathy. You did that because you are an empathetic, good person. What they do with it is on them. But you should want to help as many people as possible, regardless of the outcome and regardless of what they do in that circumstance. Now, obviously, there are programs, there are systems, institutions that keep track of the most effective way to help people. And there's an argument for, the way we divvy up tax dollars and the way that we organize society. But in terms of healthcare, I don't care if you're going to the doctor twice a fucking week, like, racking up doctor's bills because you have anxiety, because you're just not well, or because you like going to see the doctor. I, at the end of the day, want everybody to have access and the ability to live a healthy life, regardless of what position they're in life and regardless of how they've acted. We have to learn to trust each other. And I get that that's hard when we can't agree. And Ben makes a point. We all, in this country, we're incredibly polarized. People are constantly online bickering, fighting over trans issues, voting rights, gun rights, like all of this stuff, abortion rights, religion in schools, how to teach kids, what do we teach kids, sex ed, all of this stuff. But I do think healthcare should be and could be, if communicated correctly, a fundamental, non-negotiable element to everybody's life that we can stand up for the same way speech is. I wish people treated others as healthcare the same way they treat freedom of speech. How many freedom of there's free speech absolutists. I want healthcare absolutists. I want people who are like, I don't give a fuck. I just want everyone to have healthcare, have the ability to pay those bills, or better yet, not have to worry about that and just be concerned with their health. We'd be a much healthier company, and I think this would also drive us to be a much more communal, much more understanding, sympathetic, empathetic country. It would grow a communal spirit that we just don't have in the U.S.
There are social penalties for you not doing it, right? If you refuse to engage in the duties of the community, then we cannot have you over for lunch, right? We cannot have you at the synagogue, right? There are certain penalties that attach, but you can do that at a small level. As you abstract up the chain, it becomes more and more difficult. And one of the things I see, and this happens pretty frequently on both sides of the aisle, is an attempt to take your top-level solution and cram it all the way down in a universalistic fashion. So people will take sort of a democratic socialism that might apply in your local community, and they'll say, okay, well, I want to apply that at the national level. But that's not, you can't do that. Or you'll say libertarians will do the same thing. I'm a libertarian. I think there should be no internal penalties for any individual decision that you want to make. That's not going to work in your family, and it's not going to work in your local community. In other words, the levels of control that you exercise ought to change based on the level of abstraction that we're talking about.
I think that part of the problem is we don't see each other as fellow Americans at all. And we're so divided that, I think you make a valid point in, at least some portion of the country wanting to reject some of these national policies or national programs. They don't see someone living in here. You know what? I'll put it in the context of the left and honestly what my own biases were. And what I used to see the middle of America as and how I've kind of grown away from that. This is kind of embarrassing to admit, but I'm obsessed with that show, Yellowstone, specifically because it kind of destroyed my preconceived notions about a huge part of this country, right? So the show, I think,
it's like the number one show in America.
In tearing down stereotypes about people in Wyoming, definitely, but ranchers, conservatives, all of that. You watch that show and you start remembering, oh, wait, yeah, they're Americans. They're like us. They have maybe a different lifestyle, but at the end of the day, they want the exact same things. I think what's important is to, like, again, bring the temperature down for a second and give Americans accurate information about what the policies would really do, and then allow them to vote on that on their own, right? Instead of trying to sway them in one direction or another. Americans know that healthcare is broken in this country. I think that, there's a lot of, on both sides, certainly. I mean, corporate Democrats and corporate media like MSNBC, they hate Medicare for all. I mean, they've been tearing it down from the beginning. Same with CNN. The question that we heard over and over again when Bernie Sanders was running and promoting Medicare for all was, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? Okay, great. They don't ask the same question when it comes to shelling out tens of billions of dollars for a war effort in Ukraine. Like, there is no debate about it. Now, look, I happen to think it's important to help Ukraine defend itself because we made security commitments after Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. We were part of those negotiations. I think it's important to keep our promises. But with that said, it is interesting how the corporate media puts its thumb on the scale. They pretend like, oh my God, this is the most costly thing in the world. How are we going to pay for it? But when it comes to other issues, like issues that would enrich defense contractors, there is no conversation about how we're going to pay for it. That's a problem.
I mean, I totally agree that we should always have the conversation about how we're going to pay for it. And I also agree that what is happening in Ukraine, it may be an unpopular position on some parts of the right, but I've been an advocate of funding Ukraine. It seems like the single...
Wow. Anna got Ben to be utterly based in this.
Best defense investment that the United States has made in the recent past. For a relatively cheap cost, we've absolutely crippled the Russian military, which is something I think is probably a good thing, globally speaking. With that said, there obviously is a difference in scale between the amount of money that we're spending in Ukraine and the amount of money that would take to do Medicare for all.
Right.
And there are obviously significant drawbacks to Medicare. I mean, if you look at the NHS, for example, there's a recent article in the New York Times talking about the delays in, for example, ambulances, people waiting 12, 24 hours, literally on a field, not being able to get what they need because once you make systems national, you're going to have to in some way ration the resources. And then the question becomes, what are the resources? Either you have to increase the resources that you're utilizing, which means increasing taxes or increasing regulations, or you have to regulate the amount of care that people can receive on the other end. Well, my personal experience with sort of a Medicare for all system is in Israel, their emergency care is very good. And if you have cancer, you are in serious trouble. And this happens to be what the statistics kind of bear out. The United States has the highest 5-year survival rate for things like breast cancer. If you have a serious disease, people are coming to the United States for surgery, for treatment. If you have a broken arm.
Now, all the stuff he's talking about, very expensive. In terms of the United States, if you are willing to spend the money, we have good healthcare. This is what Anna was also talking about when she mentioned like preventative care. The reason why Israel, as a good example, doesn't really have a robust, or at the very least a comparable to the United States cancer program in terms of like addressing that sort of thing is because, and I'm willing to bet if I go look this up, their rate of cancer probably isn't that high, or their rate of catching it early is a lot higher. See, when you're preventative care, like, again, it always comes down to, if you're spending more money in preventative care, you're going to save money on the back end for high end stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean that people who get those higher level diseases are like completely fucked, but it's just like, there's not the same kind of system because it's just that much more rare. Now, in the US, we already have all of this amazing infrastructure in terms of like addressing cancer diagnoses, right? So even then we would, like, since those are already in place, moving to a Medicare for all system, or moving to a system that is a lot more preventative focused, we wouldn't suddenly lose any of those cancer programs. Those cancer programs would then become preventative cancer programs. We would actually probably, I'm not a fortune teller or anything, but I suspect that those organizations would then be able to focus more on research. And also, like, you still, like, those businesses aren't going to go anywhere. Those hospitals aren't going to go anywhere. They're still going to be here. There's still going to be people over the preceding years as the country gets progressively healthier in terms of its healthcare. So, like, I get what he's saying, but I do think that, like, because of where we are and because of where we started, since we started where, in terms of like having very good, expensive healthcare, scaling down that very expensive healthcare is going to still always be there. and those programs aren't just going to disappear like that, you know? So
you're probably better off in a nationalized healthcare system because it's fairly simple thing to solve, and it's not going to cost you, quote unquote, anything except indirectly.
But I think it's really important to differentiate the quality of care that is available in the United States, which I agree with you is fantastic if you can afford it. And when it comes to your life, or when it comes to a family member's life, let's say you don't have the money up front to pay for the procedures or the treatment that
if you're
you
coming,
need,
yeah,
right?
Like, because if you're coming from Israel to America, it means you have quite a bit of money. Poor people who live in Israel do not come to America to get cancer treatment because they can't afford it. Like, they wouldn't be able to afford it anyway. Like, and Americans who live in America can't afford a lot of cancer treatments. So, like,
people are willing to go into debt because at the end of the day, it's about your life. And I am tired of seeing elderly individuals, retired individuals in this country lose everything, go bankrupt because of how broken our healthcare system is. It needs to be fixed. So on one hand, I agree with you. The quality of care is certainly here. It's where people come to get the treatment they need. But in a lot of cases, Americans go bankrupt for this. I'll give you an example. My mom was diagnosed with she'll be okay with me sharing this because I've talked about it on the show before. She was diagnosed with blood cancer last year.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and it was really difficult because her bone marrow stopped producing hemoglobin, and we didn't know what was wrong with her before she got diagnosed. She was just very, very weak. She had no color at all. It was terrifying. She had to keep going in to get blood transfusions. Finally, they diagnosed her, and they said, look, the good news is there is a medication. You can be on this medication for the rest of your life. It's a chemotherapy medication. It's called Revlimid, but it's monopolized. And even though Revlimid was discovered decades ago, and I think the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken, the way patent law works with pharmaceutical drugs, I mean, they've found loopholes and they were able to extend the patent, extend it. So there's only one option. And even with insurance, I mean, my mom's older, you know, she's covered and everything. Even with insurance, it's $2,500 out of pocket. And, you know, I'll do anything to keep my mom alive. You know, we'll contribute to it. Luckily, you know, they found a solution. She's doing great. But if you don't have the privileges that...
And a lot of those solutions, by the way, are taxpayer funded. A lot of those subsidies in local areas and in hospitals are subsidized by your local government, which means at the end of the day, you're already kind of paying for it. So wouldn't it be easier to cut out that middle part? Like...
my family has. If you don't have family members who are making enough money to contribute to help pay for that medication, you are screwed. You're either going to go bankrupt or you're just going to decide, I'm not going to get the medication and I'm just going to end my life that way.
Right.
And I don't want Americans suffering from that. So we need to find a better solution. And so far, from what I've noticed in different models in other countries, that single payer solution seems to be the best option.
Right, so
it's the only one that covers
that you have to
everyone.
Take into account a few different things in a situation like that. One is the cost of development of drugs. Virtually all medical patents happen in the United States, specifically because it is a free market system.
We fund the research and development, though.
Well, I mean, we do, but it's not even close to what the actual medical companies spend on research and development. What the federal government spends on R&D for medical product is so much lower than what Pfizer spends on R&D. And it takes forever for, I mean, the vast majority of these things are washouts. Hundreds of billions of dollars will be spent on drugs.
For pharmaceutical companies?
By pharmaceutical companies that don't go to phase 3.
I mean, they certainly provide quite a bit to their shareholders. So.
Well, I mean, it depends on which ones. You're looking at the ones that actually succeed. I mean,
we're also first of all, we're also talking about pharmaceutical companies who their shareholders do not make money on the products they create. They make money on the speculative value of their stock.
For every pharmaceutical company that succeeds and actually becomes a thing, there are a dozen that fail. I mean, this is just the way that biopharmaceuticals work. I was talking with my friend Vivek Ramaswamy, who founded Roivant Sciences, and this is literally how he used to invest. The idea was that you invest in a bevy of drugs, like a basket, and the vast majority of them will die before phase 3, and a few of them will be successful. How do you make up all the money to pay for all the ones that fail in order to pay for the one that succeeds? So how do you continue to incentivize it? So I think that the questions that we ask are the same questions. The solutions are different. So how do we continue to incentivize the creation of drugs that can help your mom? 2, how do we help your mom pay for the drugs once she gets sick without destroying the incentive? 3, how do we actually incentivize doctors to care for your mom with, say, Medicare reimbursement rates that aren't significantly lower than what they can get cash out of pocket, which very often you're seeing doctors in specialized fields just stop taking Medicare entirely because they're operating now across the table. They'll just say, we'll take cash only. This happens in the surgical profession a lot.
Right.
And so,
well, yeah, because doctors want to make a lot of money. And to that, it's always like, cool, then don't be a doctor. I don't want doctors who are in it to make like a bevy of money. I want them to be in it to actually like produce good outcomes. And also, at the end of the day, like if we're talking about a Medicare for all system, a lot like you would just have to put into the legislation, or the way you write it, you would have to really elevate like specific doctors, which would be kind of easy if they're taking care of a lot of the preventative care. You know, doctors going into private practices are just being like, you know, your regular old, like, you know, doctor runs an office in your local community. Like that guy's going to have consistent people, like a consistent clientele base, and he's going to make consistent money from what he's going to get kickback from the government in terms of covering their healthcare. Like the negotiating costs are a lot, can be driven more towards doctors. Like I'm fine with doctors making more money. It's the pharmaceuticals, it's a lot of these hospitals that drive up costs needlessly because they're in the money-making market. This is why we also like, Ben Shapiro talks about like the profit motive to creating drugs. I don't want a profit motive to create drugs because a lot of drug research begins usually at people trying to cure diseases. A lot of this stuff starts in colleges. A lot of it starts in government funded programs. I want those people working on it, not somebody who's interested in making a buck off of it. It's just like the profit motive for some things I just don't think are applicable. And I think like while can reduce good outcomes, I think they will inevitably always lead to that profit-seeking behavior overwhelming the like human good behavior going forward.
So there, I think systems that are in between what we have and single-payer healthcare that have been significantly more efficient in this respect. Switzerland is one of them. Singapore is another one of them. My argument isn't with restructuring the system. It's how we restructure the system. And the simplicity of the NHS comes with significant downstream effect,
right.
Which is...
The one other thing I'll say is, okay, so just quickly on the pharmaceutical drugs. I mean, you will admit, though, right, that when you look at the amount of money Americans are charged for pharmaceutical drugs relative to any other country, we're being price gouged.
Well, we are subsidizing the rest of the world in their price gouging is how I put it.
I mean...
The reason I say that is because we are paying free market prices and they are paying cartelizes. They've cartelized their pricing structure. And so we...
Well, sure, you can say that, but like... their societies get drugs for cheaper. That's our fault for being dumbasses. Like you can say like, oh well, these other countries aren't participating in free market. Who gives a shit? These other countries are doing what is best for their societies. We're not, and that's our fucking fault. Like if the argument is like, oh well, like we're subsidizing other countries, cool. We shouldn't be doing that then. Then we should be doing what they do, because clearly they're getting a better deal than us. So what the fuck are we doing taking a bad deal? Like,
we could theoretically bargain negotiate with the drug companies, and then all the patents will get filed elsewhere. That is the other downside.
In the very least, I mean, one of the proposed policy solutions in Build Back Better that was nixed was allowing for Medicare to negotiate drug prices on behalf of Medicare recipients.
Right.
That was squashed. I mean, not entirely. I think there's like a handful of drugs.
It's
that
like
are
10.
allowed.
It's for this reason. It's because the great fear in terms of the incentive structure was, if you allow Medicare, which supports a huge percentage of people who are taking these drugs, to negotiate the price, what you're going to do is remove essentially the R&D budgets of a lot of these companies.
I'm not buying that.
Well, I mean,
at all.
the truth is the profit margins in these companies. I mean, take for example Moderna. Moderna had to sink.
And this is why you decouple the profit margin from healthcare, from pharmaceuticals. Like the core problem is always like Ben Shapiro makes it very clear, and this he's honest. The profit margin is always going to be the incentive. So you take away that incentive structure, plain and simple. Like that is what you need to target then.
I think tens of billions of dollars into the development of RNA vaccines, and it was a complete failure until COVID. I mean, like that was Moderna was essentially bankrupt before COVID happened. And this is unfortunately the way that science very often works, that it fails and fails and fails and fails until it succeeds. And it costs and costs and costs until it succeeds. And this is, I think, a general point about business that people should understand as a person who is a business person, runs a successful business. For every business that gets founded and succeeds, and people see the really rich person at the very top, they miss the 5 businesses that they started before that failed. And literally, for me and my business partner, it was several businesses that we had started before that did not succeed until we hit the one that actually worked. And they don't see the other businesses that started and failed. Most industries are more like the restaurant business than they are like any other.
Well, I mean, look, you're going to start a business and you take a risk. And if you succeed, you succeed. If you fail, you fail. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about Americans funding research and development for these pharmaceutical drugs, I don't think it makes sense for us to then be price gouged by these companies, which, look, I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I wish I did. But you look at the profits from these pharmaceutical companies.
It's insane.
The amount of money they make profit alone every year, year after year, the amount of money they pay their executives year after year. I don't think you can make the case that the amount that they charge Americans for these drugs.
You would also have to ask, like, you know, the money that they're giving to like CEOs and all the rest of these executives, what value are they creating? Do CEOs make new drugs? Are any of these companies, the only thing they're doing after a drug, after like this or that drug is created, you know, discovered, created, and patented and everything, what are they doing? They're just manufacturing it after that point. But that's, for the most part, that's pretty much it. They have manufacturing costs, they have R&D budgets, sure, but like, okay, that's it. Like what, at what point is it that like we've put the incentive of them making money over the lives of the people that they're facilitating with their medicine? So it's like, you know, it's always like you know, sense. We as a society need to put people first.
We'll have to disagree on that one. It's fun, but we're getting to disagree on that stuff. So let's talk about some of the other issues. I've had you diagnose the Democratic Party, so now diagnose the Republican Party. We'll get to that in just 1 second. First,
holy shit. Ben is proving why he has a business, a lot of sponsors.
Agreements in terms of you want more government control and regulation of industry generally. You're a big fan of labor unions. Obviously, you and I have a wide-scale disagreement on that. I think that they radically raise costs, which is why you've seen so much business move out of the country, and also why you've seen fewer and fewer members of the private sector joining.
Wait. That's why you've seen people move out of the country? Have we had unions? Have we had strong unions in this country? The only reason that companies leave the United States is not because of unions. It's because there's cheap labor elsewhere in the world. That's why. Which at the end of the day is a decision that's made by ownership, by management. The people who aren't creating value every single day. They're overseeing value, sure, but are they creating it? Are they making the tires? Are they making the food? Are they producing, you know, this or that drug? Are they driving the trains? No, they're overseeing a lot of that stuff. They're managing it. Not to say that's not worthy of, like, you know, worthy of a good wage or even skill wise, but they are not the people who input their labor to make any product valuable.
Joining unions, public sector unions are very powerful and robust in the United States. Private sector unions are increasingly not. But you know, so what are sort of the big issues? You look at the Republican Party and you say these guys are just they're out to lunch.
Well, okay, just putting policy aside for a second, it's more about what I'm noticing in terms of, I don't know if fracturing is the right word, but the Republican Party is in a little bit of a pickle, right? Because when it comes to, and tell me if I'm right about this, when you look at Republican voters, it appears that they're certainly attracted to the MAGA type candidates. So they'll do really well in primaries. But then once you get to a general election and the battle is really about those independent voters, those candidates really do struggle. And I think that's what really transpired in the 2022 midterm elections, right? These Trump-endorsed candidates who are further to the right, in my opinion, lunatics. Like, they'll do really well, but then all of a sudden they kind of try to tone down their rhetoric to appeal to either moderate Republicans or independent voters in the general election, and it's not really working out for them. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because I think you, just based on what I know about you, based on the conversations we've had, you're more of the, you're just a traditional conservative in my mind, really, right? And so, and I remember you having some analysis post midterm elections that was, you hit the mark on the head, like, or the nail on the head. It was correct in that we need to stop promoting these like far right figures who aren't appealing to a broader electorate. What do you think the solution is going to be? Because I think your analysis is correct on that.
So, I mean, I think that so much of this is attitudinal, meaning candidacies very largely in the primaries have become not about being far right politically. I mean, as you say, I'm a traditional conservative, which means it's hard to outflank me on the right. But when it comes to sort of the attitude that's taken by candidates, that's what's attractive. And that's driven largely by the polarization. I think that inside the Republican Party, there's been a move, which is sort of understandable based on how assaulted people feel by the media in particular, that the more people attack a particular person on the right, the more people on the right rush to that person's defense and say this person is just the best thing since sliced bread. And that is, I think people see that as beginning with Trump, and it really didn't. I mean, I've been here the whole time, and I think that for a lot of Republicans, that really started mainly with McCain. The sort of move from, I can't believe these people, like John McCain is about as moderate a member of the Republican Party as it is possible to find. And yet suddenly he runs for president and he's the worst person in the entire world. He's garbage. He's terrible. What's going on? And then the Republican Party responds by nominating the most milquetoast human being on planet Earth in 2012, Mitt Romney, who is as inoffensive as dishwater. I mean, he's just...
Sometimes I completely forget Mitt Romney exists.
White bread. He's white bread with margarine. I mean, and everybody on the left immediately went to, he's the most scary person. He's forcibly cutting the hair of gay kids in the 50s. And he's the person who straps a dog to the top of his car. And Joe Biden out there saying he's going to put y'all back in chains. Mitt Romney's going to put y'all back in chains. What in the... And so Republicans responded to that. Many conservatives did by like, why aren't we fighting this? We need to fight. Whoever is willing to punch somebody in the face is the person we're going to support. And so that's how you get Trump. And then Trump wins. And so because Trump wins, there's this sort of...
I find it really interesting that Ben doesn't want to talk about the very, very deep polarization that has been going on in the Republican Party since the 1990s with the advent of talk radio. Conservative talk radio, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, incredibly, what's the word? Responsible for where the Republican Party is today as a movement, as a party. The influence of talk radio, I think, cannot be understated. Absolutely not understated at all.
Halo effect that has now accrued to people who are quote unquote punchers. Now, I do think that the solution to that for the Republican Party is to find people who are smarter punchers. I like the punching. I think the punching very often is necessary, right? That's why I like Governor DeSantis in Florida. I think he's intelligent about how he throws punches. I mean, like him or hate him, the guy's much more strategic than Donald Trump.
He also didn't take any of Trump's bait. I mean,
right? No, I mean he's a very strategic thinker. He's somebody who really tries to pick his fights, right? If somebody tries to pick a fight with him, he is not always going to pick up the glove and just slap back. Trump's big thing was you can't hit me without getting hit on any score ever, and that's not DeSantis. So I think that the idea that the Republican Party is not going to be combative in the future is wrong. It is going to be combative, and it's okay to be combative, but you have to pick the right targets. By the way, the same thing is true on the left. I mean, I think that when you see Democratic candidates, very often there's an attraction to sort of the most wild-eyed because it's like, wow, the right really hates this person. They must be really, really fantastic. I think you see some of this from the squad. But there are definitely counterpunchers in the Democratic Party who know how to punch and are much more strategic in how they go about that. That is, I think, the future of the Republican Party. That's at least the hope of the Republican Party. If not, what you're going to get is whoever says the wildest thing and draws the most fire is by necessity. What I've said to Republicans is you're essentially letting the left pick your candidates. You're letting the left target the person and then hit them. And the more they hit them, the more you're like, that guy's great. Love that guy. Say, well, maybe they're hitting him, yeah, because he's on the right, but maybe they're hitting him also because he's a bad candidate and because some of the stuff he's saying is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, Herschel Walker was not.
He's a bad candidate.
He was a terrible candidate.
He's a bad candidate.
Absolutely terrible. I mean, same with Oz, right? I mean, and that's the other thing. I feel like the quality of candidates has really gone down, and it's really that has accelerated post-Trump, and it's like, I guess anyone can run for Senate now. Like, what's going on? I mean, that is a serious job. We've got 100 senators. It's an important job. You got to be. Look, I'm not like some elitist that thinks like, oh, you have to have this decorated record and you've done this and you've done. I like ordinary people representing Americans, but smart people who have actually thought through the policies they're promoting. I feel like you're right. There's a lot of rhetoric going on. I see a lot of that on both sides. A lot of negative campaigning where everything is about attacking the other side. Ooh, the other side is so scary. So you have to vote for us because if you don't, the other side's going to win and your life is going to be miserable. And honestly, I don't really notice much of a difference if it's a Democratic administration or Republican administration, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of talk. I feel like there's a lot of show going on, but when policies need to be passed, and I think this is partly due to how our institutions are set up as well, nothing really gets done.
Well, so I think that the purpose is that nothing should get done. But I think that the problem is that actually, in spite of that, things continue to grow. So I think we have an increasingly incompetent yet intrusive government. And so that's a bad combo. If you're going to have a government that is very intrusive, it better be damn good at what it does. And it seems like precisely the opposite. All of our institutions are failing to actually perform on the promises that they are promising. And then they promise in response more promises. And then people are like, well, that guy is promising a lot, so probably he'll do the job. It's like, well, maybe no one can do this job, which, again, I keep coming back to the localism point, but I really think that it's easier to get things done on a local level than it is on a federal. And it was designed that way, and I'm not sure that that's a bad design. I think we have outsized expectations of what the federal government can do. And what that means is that whoever promises the most and talks the biggest is the person who's likely to do well in national politics. Yuval Levin has made the point, the sort of center-right philosopher at AEI, he made the point that when it comes to Congress, when it comes to the Senate, it used to be that Congress and the Senate, these were institutions that shaped the people who went into them, right? That you became a congressperson, that meant you learned the rules, you learned the ins and the outs, you figured out exactly how policy got made, how the sausage, you cut the deals, you did the stuff in the back room, but then you campaigned on, right? It was an actual thing that shaped who you were. And now, instead of it being institutions shaping the person uses the institution as a platform. So the real reason that you go to the Senate is that eventually you can get a show on MSNBC. The real reason that you go into Congress is so that eventually you can get a contributor slot on Fox News. That basically, people like you and me who are in the commentary business, people who used to maybe aspire to go into politics, it's now the opposite. People go into politics aspire to go into the business that we are in, actually.
That's so true. And by the way, I find that so disgusting, right? Disgusting both for the media outlets that instead of hiring trained journalists, people who actually want to do unbiased reporting, instead of hiring them, it's like, let's hire, some operative within the Republican Party, someone who's in Biden's administration. I don't think that that's the right way to go. I think the partisan media is becoming more and more ingrained into today's society, and that's leading to more of the divisions that are not conducive to finding solutions that Americans want. But look, to your point about localism and all of that, this is a little bit of an example of what I'm seeing happen on the left that kind of reinforces your point. You go to Scandinavian countries and they don't have a federal minimum wage. What they have is trade unions who negotiate wages based on their workers.
Right.
That's why I want worker power, right? That's why I want workers to be organized. I think it's a far better solution to have labor unions engage in those negotiations and those debates with the employers, as opposed to sitting around and waiting for this insanely corrupt federal government to keep their promises in raising the minimum wage. Minimum wage hasn't been raised.
Trade unions also provide the unemployment benefits, by the way, in Scandinavia.
They do. That's right.
They essentially do the job of what the federal government tries to do here.
One of the major components or factors in wages stagnating beginning in the 1970s was the decline of labor union membership. So that was the decade when labor unions really started to kind of fall apart to the point where we are today. Now we're starting to see a little more labor militancy. Honestly, that's the only thing that's giving me a little bit of optimism and hope for the future, because I've kind of given up on thinking that the federal government is going to solve these issues that workers have been dealing with for decades now. But to your point, I do think that there are solutions that are outside of the federal government, and it's really about empowering ordinary people. But it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take organizing. It's going to take putting your cultural differences aside, because that's an issue that the left has as well, in my opinion, where they want everyone to be pure, everyone to be exactly in line with them ideologically, culturally. Americans are not like that, though. There's a lot of diversity of thought, diversity of opinion. We have different lived experiences, different backgrounds. We need to meet people where they are and not assume that someone who might disagree with you on something is automatically a bad person or a rabid right-winger or whatever they want to, accuse the other of.
And by the way, when it comes to private sector unions, I'm actually not fundamentally on principle against private sector unions as long as there's freedom of negotiation and as long as people aren't getting kneecapped on the side of the road. Right? The idea of collective bargaining, that's been part of negotiations since the beginning of time. There's nothing wrong with a set of workers saying, we wish to come and negotiate for a higher wage. The employer just has to also be able to say no from time to time. Otherwise, start your own company.
Yeah.
This is why I remember when last time we talked, we were talking about the idea of, and Bernie was big on this, the idea of sort of collectivization of ownership of companies. And I said, that's called a stock agreement. That's fine. I mean, if you and your friends want to put together a company and you own the stock in the company and you decide the wages, that's just called the company. Like that's fine. And in fact, very often you have some of the biggest sort of collectively owned organizations. I think the biggest one in the world, I believe, is in Spain.
Yes, Madrigal?
Yeah,
yes.
I think that's right. And they actually engage in hardcore capitalistic competition.
That's right.
And have had to cram down on their own workers wage decreases when the market actually undercuts them because ownership is still ownership.
But those are decisions that are democratically made within the organization.
Because it's connected to the people who actually have a stake in the organization.
That's right.
Meaning, and if you choose to take the risk, then you also choose to reap the reward.
Man, holy shit. Anna just fucking like red pilled fucking Ben over here on on fucking socialism. Jesus. Yeah, that's like the reason why we don't see it in the US, and this is also a key factor in it. The reason why we don't see a lot of what they're mostly describing is what's the term? I might actually have to look it up because I can't remember it right now. Mondragon Corporation. Yeah. Where is it? Worker cooperative. There it is. That's what I was looking for. Yeah. So like the reason why worker cooperatives like Mondragon is not, you don't see them pop up in the United States very often, if ever, is mainly because to be able to start any kind of company like that, you're going to need startup capital. And a lot of banks just aren't willing. A lot of banks, especially right now, are not willing to loan money to workers, basically, to start their own businesses, to start their own worker cooperatives. We also kind of, to a degree, need the government to step into that a little bit to I think kind of incentivize, investing and loaning out to worker co-ops. But that is kind of I think the good next step in terms of transforming how our economy and how work is organized in the United States.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the big problems, obviously, is that when we try to posit sort of labor versus management, what both sides are putting in there, there's an opinion by labor that labor is the sort of labor theory of value. Labor is the only thing that's valuable to the organization.
Not the
I
only.
don't agree with that, but it is a huge revenue.
I would argue it's the plurality.
The revenue is created by the workers, and I think that part of the equation is completely left out of the discussion when you're in America.
Well, again, I mean, I think that part of the revenue is created by the worker. Some is created by the capital risk that was made by the person.
Sure.
Some of it's created by the corporate structure.
So here's the thing, like whenever anybody talks about capital risk, like that's a fixed amount. If you take out a loan of, let's say, like $500,000 to start your business, right? After you pass $500,000 in profit to you, like after you've collected a salary over like $500,000, you've broken even now. Like you can't continue, after you've invested and after you've made your money back for that investment, you can't continue to argue, yeah, but like I had to take out the loan to start the business. You already made your money back. If you've already gotten to the point where you've made your money back, or you're on track to make your money back very, like almost assuredly, then there's no argument to be made about like, oh, but we need to, the ownership needs to, in my opinion, what we should have is there should be a threshold that once you've reached as a capital owner of a business, after you've reached a certain threshold, you should, be, what's the word I'm looking for? You should be converted into a worker, and your company transformed into a worker co-op. Your workers then would take the company, continue to have it function in the way that not only benefits them but benefits you as well, because you've become a worker now. But like this the idea of ownership into infinitum, I think, is absurd. There is absolutely a point where the owner stopped creating value. Absolutely. They did it in the beginning. They took all the risk up front. and then they got paid throughout the years. But after a certain point, you've already made back your investment. You need to either go make another company, or you become part of this worker cooperation. You become part of it. Now your workers are going to decide how the company functions, everything else along with you. You'll get a voice just like they do. But like this outsized influence over it, I think is just I think it's absurd. I don't think it's really conducive to good business either. It's good for one person. It's really good for the owner. They get to, if the company fails or does well, all these people's jobs are at risk. This person already made all of the, the person at the top already made all their money back. They can do whatever they want with the business. I don't think that's right for our for how to organize society from an economic and moral standpoint.
Sure. And this is why, again, I'm not against collective bargaining in a free market system where you're saying, listen, and we do this on an individual level. I think one of the big problems that we've had in terms of collective bargaining is that because it used to be that labor was very striated, it was a lot easier to do collective bargaining because so many jobs now are sort of individualized. This isn't to speak to like fast food workers or something, but you're talking about, at our company, for example, or your company, for example, you have very specialized jobs. And so the idea that you can collectively bargain for very specialized jobs, with very specialized job descriptions, it's actually incredibly hard to do that with any level of actual rationale.
No, I mostly agree with you on that. So for instance, look, we have a portion of TYT that is unionized. I'm not part of that union because of the specialized nature of the work I do.
Correct.
So these
you couldn't unionize.
Right. These are the graphics artists, the editors. They decided to do it. More power to them. It's worked out, and I'm glad that they did it, and they're happy about it, right? But when I think about labor unions, I'm mostly thinking about major companies like, let's say, Amazon, which, you're seeing more and more of these Amazon warehouses either attempt to unionize, or in some cases, they've been successful in unionizing. I think it makes sense in that area, especially when you're talking about a company that's so massive that the workers are just they become numbers, right?
So again, if people are willing to join a union and then go at the company that way, that's fine. My big problem is that I think the National Labor Relations Board is rigged completely on behalf. I'm sure you love the NLRB. I despise the NLRB more than.
Is fantastic.
The NLRB should be disbanded. It's a garbage organization. It's garbage.
I disagree with you on that wholeheartedly. Listen, the Starbucks stores that tried to unionize, and by the way, many of them, hundreds of them, have succeeded in their union elections, and they have unionized. I mean,
imagine sticking up for Amazon on this end.
Strategies that we've seen from the executives at Starbucks have been pretty disgusting. People who have been fired just because they've brought up the topic of organizing the workplace, just all sorts of violations. If it weren't for Biden's relatively labor-friendly NLRB, they'd have no protections at all.
Well, I mean, your protection theoretically is in how good a job you do along with your fellow.
Well, no, but but if you, I've had people in jobs, has this not happened to people where the word union is mentioned and there's a manager, there is somebody higher up the food chain who will come to you and will be like, hey, look, you keep talking about this, they're gonna close the store, or they're gonna bring you in for this or that, or they'll find something that maybe you're not a fit at the company anymore, maybe this, maybe that. But everybody, I feel like, has had this situation where they've been told, hey, you're not allowed to talk about union stuff. You're not allowed to talk about unions. You're not allowed to talk about collective bargaining. Not allowed to talk about any of that stuff. I've had managers come up to me and tell me about, give me that exact speech of hey, look, they'll just close the store. And how can you have, Ben talks about a free market. How can you have a free market when any company has this much outsized power over its workers? You can't. You can't have a free market. You can't have a free market if a company is allowed to shut down a store location on the threat of collective bargaining. You have to defend that that workplace's ability to organize. They need the ability to organize, or they don't have any that's something that the NLRB is at the very least. At the absolute very least, is essential for, is giving workers the ability to even consider a collective bargaining, to even consider and engaging in what Ben has admitted is a fundamental part of free market capitalism.
employees.
Well, I mean,
The
when it
NLRB,
comes...
I mean, I have, listen, the
Yeah.
NLRB is the kind of place where I made a joke online at one point that if somebody tried to take editorial control of my show on the basis of unionization, I would fire them. And the NLRB...
They can't, though. I mean, that is a ridiculous thing for anyone to attempt to do.
Well,
Yeah.
of course, the NLRB sent me a missive, and I had to get a lawyer to explain to them that, number one, it's a joke, and number two, because
Wait, they actually try to do that?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. This is
But
Ben
isn't that a
Domenech
free
over at the
speech
Federalist.
issue?
Yeah, it is. It's 100% a free speech issue. Number two, editorial control is not implicated by labor contracts. Labor contracts are about wages and hours.
Correct.
Right,
yeah.
and working conditions. It's not you get to unionize at the Daily Wire to decide that you don't like my editorial control. I'm the owner of the company. That's not how that
Right,
works.
right.
So, I mean, the regulatory overreach there is really...
They
is really
sent
bad.
you a
This is
letter.
not to
Calm
deny that there are
down.
circumstances.
They sent
You're
you
a
a
coal
letter.
miner, and all the coal miners in town are being jobbed by the machinery. Of course you should unionize, right? Norma Ray. Okay, fine. But the idea that the federal government is supposed to cram down on Amazon, that it has to pay people a certain wage when...
Yeah, but how else, like, you say that, but how else does Amazon not grow to the point that it's outsized, not just the government, but outsized the ability for its workers to demand better working conditions? Like, at the end of the day, the workers are only going to have usually a certain amount of power, right? Like, there is a ceiling to how much leverage workers have. That ceiling is usually, we'll just walk out and your company's going to have to like figure out how to recover from that. But like, these companies have such an outsized ability to influence millions of people's lives. If we're talking Amazon or something, I should say more like thousands, but I don't actually know how many employees they have. But either way, like, the ability for this one company, for Jeff Bezos as one guy, to be able to influence this many people's lives is actually fucking insane. Like you need some kind of way to equalize these two groups. You can't do it through power. You do it through leverage.
And there are other people who are willing to work for below that wage in the same exact town. Like, how is that consensual? Consent seems to need to exist on both sides when it comes to labor relations.
Yeah, look, the NLRB's main role is protecting workers who might deal with their employer raining terror on them if they are organizing the workplace. You know, the retaliatory strategies that we've seen from companies like Starbucks have been pretty gross. We need to allow people to have those conversations, to organize their workplace without...
Also, this is the case where, like, we as a society have decided that you're not allowed to sell your labor under a certain point because it would be incredibly damaging to the to basically the economic makeup, the economic like function of like the United States. If there was an ability for people to sell their labor for like $4, right, it would utterly destroy this country's ability to create profit and to actually have people working at dignified wages. Like there's no positive end to this. Sometimes you don't get consent in these things. You don't get consent when it comes to wearing a seatbelt. The government has decided, nope, it is in your best interest to wear a seatbelt, and we're going to make sure it's always there because we're going to legislate and demand that car manufacturers put it in your car. Because we have found that not having seatbelts is incredibly dangerous and kills more people. There are some things that you just can't, as a society, you can't opt out of. Like, that's just kind of one of those. If you want to go somewhere else, you want to go to, I don't even know what country doesn't make you wear seatbelts or, whatever it might be. But like, you can go wherever. You have freedom to move as wherever the fuck you want. But at least in America, there are American standards. And I don't think, when it comes to wages, it's like, yeah, like we can't like obviously Ben Shapiro understands that having, immigrants come over and take up jobs for pennies on the dollar compared to American citizens has lowered the ability for American citizens to bargain for higher wages, right? Like, he understands that relationship. To then legitimize or I should say implement that relationship between all Americans, you would see that trickle down to every sector, to every single worker. You would have such a hard time making even $10, because the goal at the end of the day as a company is to get the most amount of labor out of you for the least amount of money. And if they can pay somebody $1 less than you, that means they're going to be looking at, when you're making, if the person next to you is making $9, you're making 10, you're both doing the same job. When your rent goes up, and guess what? That person's rent goes up too. But, they have like 5 jobs. So they're like, they cobble it together with 5 jobs. When you go in and say, hey, my rent went up, I just need, maybe $1 just to keep up with the rent increase. They'll say, no, we actually can't do that. This other guy does your job for $1 less. So you can either go down, you can either stay where you are or get another job. And now guess what? Now you're working 2 jobs. Now you're splitting your time between there and somewhere else. Now maybe you're working more than 40 hours. Like, it would be detrimental to the way that our society functions and the quality of life our people have to go to a like flat system of like, oh, we shouldn't have a minimum wage. It's just be like whatever people end up bargaining for. That's what they should get. Like, you don't want to be in that position. If you've ever had to go in and like go into interview and you're looking to make like a certain dollar amount, like, how stressful it is to make that first call of like, this is how much I'm looking for an hour. Now imagine if that could be $1. If they could get away with $1. If you take 10, maybe you need 12. You're like, oh, I need 12. They'll go, well, we can give a lot of people $1, or you can accept $8. How about that? That's the compromise. Like, there's just no way. It would destroy our economy. Destroy people.
Fear of retaliation from their employer, right? So that's the main reason why I think the NLRB is important. The anecdote that you shared about, what happened with you and the editorial control, that is insane. And look, I'm not going to name names, obviously, but we had a similar issue, not with the union, but with employees who didn't like some of the commentary from me or some of the commentary from Cenk. That's called sad day for you. If you can't handle differences of opinion, then this is not the career path you should go in. That is free speech. And guess what? We're also workers. I'm a worker. I have my rights too. I should be able to speak my mind on the show that I produce and host. But, aside from that, I just think that there is an imbalance of power right now, and it's because of the fact that labor unions have been dismantled in this country. And workers need those collective bargaining rights in order to have a say, not just in what they're getting paid, but also their workplace conditions. I think the rail workers and what the Democratic-controlled Congress did to the rail workers was pretty gross. I don't know what you felt about that, but rail workers deserve to be able to take a day off, or more than just a day off if they're sick or if they have a family emergency, without being penalized by their employer. And the fact that, during these labor negotiations, they couldn't even secure that. And you had the Biden administration literally put its thumb on not literally, but put its thumb on the scale to prevent them from striking, I disagree with entirely.
So, on principle, I'm not in favor of unions being able to bargain for more than they can get. When it comes to the internal turmoil in the Democratic Party, having problems with the labor unions that it seeks to appease, I admit that I enjoyed it. But
it shows you, but that's the thing, Ben, like, it's really important to differentiate between the principled left, right? I'm not just saying leftists, the principled left, those who actually want to empower labor, and then the Democrats who pay lip service to labor unions. And that is why you are seeing working people start to realign their political ideology, unfortunately, in some cases, with the right, because they will hear someone like Trump pay lip service to workers, even though talk is cheap. He didn't actually follow through with a lot of what he said. But just acknowledging those issues that workers have been dealing with made Trump super appealing to them.
Well, I think in the future, one of the places where there will actually be bipartisan agreement is, I think indirectly, it will have serious effects on labor, but the sort of willingness now to face up to the threat that China represents is going to have some pretty dramatic impact on reshaping supply chains, on reshaping how manufacturing and labor work, particularly in the United States. I think a lot of the outsourcing that has gone to China is going to be reshored in fairly short order, given the fact that both parties are now realizing what a threat China represents.
Well, look, and aside from China being an adversary and all of that, and I'm a little uneasy with some of the rhetoric that I'm seeing, and it seems like an area where Democrats and Republicans are united. The rhetoric, I don't want it to lead toward an actual war with China, and I feel like
I'm assuming this
Biden
is like before the
irresponsible
big
with some of the things he said, like, oh, if China invades Taiwan, we'll have boots on the ground. Don't say stuff like that. That's incredibly stupid. But in terms of the manufacturing issues, the supply chain issues, I'm very happy to see that politicians are finally waking up to the fact that we need to manufacture things in the United States. I mean, this is one of the failures of, Venezuela's policies. They stopped manufacturing things, started importing everything. And once oil prices went down, and oil, of course, is their number one commodity and export, they were screwed, right? So
if you've ever seen Wu-Tang Financial, diversify your bonds. You don't want an economy that's based on only one sector. That will always eventually fail you.
We experienced how insanely fragile our supply chains are. We need to manufacture jobs here in the United States, or manufacture products and bring jobs back here to the United States. I like that we're headed in that direction to some extent. The CHIPS Act is a good example of that. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
I think there's certain specified industries, chips are obviously one of them,
right,
where they actually implicate national security. And so you are going to see some right-left coalitions that are sort of odd when it comes to reshoring, that sort of stuff.
Same with pharmaceutical drugs, by the way.
That's true. Yep. Any stuff that has been manufactured in China heretofore and that seriously impacts national security is going to be reshored. Much of it's not going to be reshored in the United States, by the way. A lot of it's going to end up in Vietnam. Some of it's going to end up in Thailand. Mexico. You're going to see a lot of this stuff go to other places on the globe. And the sort of countervailing point to the we need to reshore everything is that autarky has essentially been a giant failed economic strategy wherever it's been tried. The idea of all manufacturing happens in our country. All products must be produced from within. That generates economic failure. I mean, one of the reasons that Venezuela has failed is specifically because it is essentially economically isolated and self-isolated. I mean, they nationalized virtually all of their industry, and they prevented people from being able to own even within their country. I mean, there's foreign direct investment basically dried up. There's no money going into Venezuela. I mean, there's half of the story that's been told when it comes to the American economy about stagnating wages. The other half that has not been told is that what you get for your wages now is way better than what you got in 1980. I mean, that is just a reality. You would not wish to live in...
Is that true? For my wages, do I get a house? For my wages, do I get a, reasonably priced car? I mean, sure, I can buy a nice TV, but back then people could buy houses with nice TVs. I don't know what the fuck he's talking about. Unless you want to argue but the technology's better. I mean, sure, but that's gonna scale and that's relative. I don't care about comparing my 4K TV to the CRT TV from the 80s. The point is what that dollar amount got me then as opposed to now. How many times you always hear people be like, I bought Coca-Cola for 25 cents, which a lot of that is built into rising inflation and all the other systems that in modern with a modern economy and everything. Obviously there's going to be those differences, but if we're just talking simply what people got for their decent wages, people paid for college on summer jobs. People pay for college on just basic jobs. These days, you're saddled with so much more debt. The jobs aren't paying as much. You can't afford a home, but you can afford a nice apartment. You can afford maybe a nice apartment, but you're just shy of being able to afford a home. And to me, I'm I'd rather people be homeowners than be renters their whole lives.
1980. As opposed to now. You now have a refrigerator, you have a microwave, you have two cars, you have a...
Sure, okay, so if you want to talk about the technological advances...
Well, I mean the stuff that you have for your money. Aside from two specifically
But
government
there's a lot
subsidized
of
areas,
crap,
healthcare and
Ben.
education.
There's a lot of crap. Okay, so look, honestly,
Would you rather live in 1980? Like that standard of
Dude, I would rather be in a position that I'm in now in 1980. Like it all comes down to like, oh, do I get like 2 microwaves and a TV and like a couch? Like what? Like the technology wasn't there. It doesn't like I don't care about my microwave. I care about like the food that I have. If it means in 1980 you're mostly using your oven, that's perfectly fine. I'm not gonna miss my like second microwave, which I don't have. I'm not gonna miss like, oh, here's another one. We got like an air fryer recently for like Christmas or whatever. If I didn't have that air fryer, would I miss it? No. It's just an air fryer. It's just another like a device to cook food in. You know what I would like? A fucking home with multiple floors. That's what I would like. Like all the little stuff that we can now get that are like little piecemeal things. Like I don't, nobody wants any of that shit. I would rather have less like commodified commercial bullshit, but then have a house. Like I much rather have a house. Like
living.
In terms of the quality of products that Americans could buy, I want to go back to the 1950s. Okay, I'm literally.
Cuba's right there. They're still driving those cars.
I completely stopped buying new clothes. Everything I buy now is vintage, made by American garment workers in the 1950s. And those garments, by the way, look like they're brand new. Brand new. Quality. Like what we did.
But the percentage of salary that you would have to spend on that is much higher.
That's true. That's true.
So for the worker, you're not shopping vintage shops from the 50s. You're going to H&M.
So okay. So but understand. So what happened with especially this is what happened in the 1970s. We started offshoring jobs and really focused on consumerism, right? So wages started to become stagnant. But Americans were okay because they can rely on cheap products that are made in other countries.
Yeah, you're buying more cheap shit.
Labor, right?
Buying more cheap shit. So we have a bunch
of cheap crap we can buy, sure. But the quality of the stuff we're buying is not there. We have to replace it after. I mean, look at clothing in particular. You buy clothes in America that, by the way, were made in some other country, in some factory or whatever.
Usually a sweatshop.
You wash it, falls apart the next day.
I mean, that's true, but the percentage of your salary every year that you're spending on clothing is way lower than it was in 1980. And when you talk about sort of the economic narrative of the 70s, there's a count.
Geez, but you paid for clothes. You paid more for clothes, right? You paid a higher percentage for clothes, but those clothes lasted. You also paid a higher percentage for your housing in the way of a mortgage, but you get a home. Like, these are just like, that's fine. I'm fine with paying a larger percentage of my paycheck to this or that thing if it means that I'm getting meaningful value out of it. Like,
countervailing point of view, which is that heavy unionization, high labor costs in the 50s and 60s, and a time where literally the rest of the world was physically destroyed by World War II, gave us a head start, which we then blew over the course of the next 2 decades, to the point by the 1970s, we have a decade of economic stagnation with literally no stock growth from essentially 1963 all the way up till the early to mid-1980s. You have 20 years where your stocks don't actually appreciate in any serious way because the economy basically stops dead. We're getting outcompeted. The American car companies, which are the crown jewel of American industry, are getting outcompeted by Toyota and Hyundai. And by the 1970s, 1980s, we're importing all of those cars. That's not because we offshored to them. It's because we didn't offshore them. It's because
we totally did offshore. Maybe not to Asian countries. We offshored a lot. I mean, think about the Rust Belt, right? And all the manufacturing jobs that went to Mexico.
The offshoring happened later. That offshoring happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Correct,
that was an aspect of attempting to compete with the import of cars from other countries. I mean, Toyota becomes a world power in terms of being an actual global corporation because our
Toyota also makes like incredibly good cars. Like, you know, for what it's worth, Toyota and Honda, there's a reason why people drive those for as long as they do. It's because they last. They're made with quality.
Manufacturing costs in the United States are too high. We're living fat and happy off the excesses of the rest of the world being destroyed, essentially. And because of that, we could afford to do all this. We were the only game in town. And then we weren't the only game in town. Suddenly, Japan rises from the ashes and is an economic world power and is outproducing us when it comes to cars. And so you have two choices at that point. Either you go tariff, right? You actually start restricting.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Also, where's Japan's society right now? not really great. Suicide rate super high. What's it called? They're the way that the like hierarchy at like businesses in Japan work are rather, what's the word I would use? I don't really think they're super healthy. They're great for production. I'm not sure they're phenomenal when it comes to worker satisfaction. So like Japan has its own problems in terms of worker, like working, like the quality of work that people engage in. But so I'm not like, obviously their production is like insane, but at what cost? What's the other end of the cost of that? They have people, you know, their youth, especially now, don't see a lot of futures for themselves. They have a lot of different societal problems that also stem from that. So it's not, while he is right that like Japan became a huge production hub and became a like economic powerhouse, there are things that they traded for that the same way we did. It's always finding a balance. It is always finding a balance.
Restricting imports, and you generate enormous costs for your own citizens who are now having to spend more money.
Right.
Or you have to start offshoring and competing and lowering the wages. And so that's essentially what happened in the 70s.
I would go on the tariff route for sure.
So right. So I mean,
100%.
and then by the way, so Trump, right? I mean, this is sort of that right-left horseshoe that's been happening. Obviously, I wouldn't, because if you just, again, I will go back to my original point. I don't think that you'd be willing to have many takers who would be willing to go back to 1980s level standard of living.
Yeah.
From 2022. We have
the standard wasn't worse.
For as much as we can talk about the excesses of Amazon, we now live in a world in which you can take a device out of your pocket, you can hit a button, and any product on earth will arrive at your door in 2 days.
That's true. And look, that's
honestly, it's unpopular, but maybe that's just untenable. Maybe, here's the thought, maybe that's just unsustainable. There's a certain point where it's like, is this nice? Is this a thing that people like? Yeah. But is it something that we can keep up? I'm not really sure. And I mean, you know, I lived through a time before we had Amazon, before you had 2-day shipping. Life wasn't that much worse. You know, we've become, I think, a people that want it all right now. And that's a function of the way our economy has driven us and our consumer habits, which I don't think have been a positive development for us. It like sucks, but I do think that going back to a time when you couldn't get everything always so on demand, but your products was better. I think people, if like shown that like the quality doesn't take a hit, your like ability to constantly consume it might, maybe, but like if the quality of goods are just as good if not higher, I think people could be amenable to a social change like that.
That's part of consumerism, and it would certainly be a culture shock for Americans to like rethink whether or not they need all of this stuff that's made in other countries.
So that's the honest trade-off.
Yeah,
and I appreciate the honest trade-off.
No, and I am being honest. And look, I acknowledge that people might not agree with me. Most people might not agree with me. But for me, I, in my personal life, have become a lot more happy in rejecting that consumerist mentality. When I spend my money, I spend on quality items that are going to last. And I just feel better about my purchases knowing that it was made, at least at a time, when people were unionized, when they were actually making living wages, they were succeeding, they were able to buy homes for themselves and their families. I want to go back to that.
Also, the kind of like economy that she's describing, wasn't this like constantly growing, constantly expanding, this like bloated kind of economy either. The economy that she's talking about was one of steady, reliable, boring, and this is also the thing that you heard a lot in like stock circles, very boring growth. And like boring growth never feels interesting, like to people who want to like make it big and do all, you know, this or that or the other. Like boring growth like feels like it just takes forever for like, you know, things to, you know, for the economy to grow. There's like, you know, it's always this like dogged desire to see the economy grow by this or that percentage. And I can't help but just like wonder, it's like, I mean, what are we growing for? If we're not growing for quality of goods, we're just growing to what? Deliver profits to executives? The quality of items aren't getting better. So what is? The only person who benefits is the person at the top who's running the organization, who's on the board or whatever. Like, those are the only people who benefit from this system. Fast growth, fast profits that we have nowadays, very good for the people at the top, but they flame out and end up leaving a lot of emptiness in the people, in the like workers behind that, and also for the consumers. Things just kind of flash in the pan. It gets popular, it goes away. It gets popular, it goes away. I think consistent growth is what we also need to be looking towards. You know, the time Anna's talking about was a time of much more, again, I said it earlier, consistent and boring, but reliable growth.
The fact that most Americans now are not able to buy a home in America is insane. We need to figure out what it is that's leading to this. Well, we know why we have this inequality, what we can do to lessen that economic inequality, because we want more Americans to actually enjoy that slice of the once American dream.
I mean, I think we certainly agree on enjoying the slice of American dream. How we get there is another question.
Yeah.
And when it comes to housing, I will mention that apartments are way bigger than they were in 1980. Houses are way, way bigger than they were.
Are, yep.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that apartments are bigger than they were. You still don't own them. You're not building equity. Like, it doesn't matter. Not only is it not yours, but you have no control over it. Its prices can increase wildly, outsized inflation. There's so much insecurity in the apartment market. Like, regardless of whether they're bigger, whether this, that, or the other, this apartment, what you see all back here, this shit was built in like the 80s or 70s, if I remember correctly. I forget what the paperwork on our lease says, but this was built in like the 70s or 80s. So like, we're living in a 70s, 80s sized apartment, paying modern prices. So also you have to take into account that like the quality hasn't gone up. You guys can't see it, but guess what? Popcorn ceiling. Guess what that was painted with? Lead paint. Like, am I paying less for this worse quality of paint? No. Am I paying less for this older built building? No. But somebody's making money off of it. And meanwhile, we don't live in a house. We're not building equity like within that home to then maybe use toward a bigger home or use towards just another home in a different area. So like the structures, the structure is the thing that needs to change. I don't care about the individual product. The individual product will get better or get worse, or you know, usually they'll end up getting better through technological advancements. But like, if we're talking about what people could afford, especially back then compared to now, they could afford houses that they got to own and build equity on. I can't. I have to live with an apartment that was built in the 1980s at best, with lead paint and everything else with it. So like, you know, how is this better? How is this any better?
1980. You know, the real question, I think, and this is an open question, I think one that people are going to have to decide, is when it comes to inequality, you can essentially, democratic socialism, which you're an advocate for, redistributes things that are already there. Capitalism generates new and better things. And so the balance has always been, how much can you continue to generate new and better things when you are redistributing what's already there?
Well, you're not taking in.
Also, capitalism doesn't create new and better. It creates new, sometimes better. There is no incentive in capitalism to always make better. The incentive is always to make cheaper. That is the incentive. Like, the incentive isn't to make a better car, it's to make a car at a lower price that you can then market a little bit better. Like regardless of how the cars come out, you want your production cost to be low. If you can keep the same price point, that's perfect.
Into account the financialization of our economy, right, which is completely disconnected from productivity. So what I mean by that is we're now in this age where companies don't even really need to focus on productivity when they can do things like
the iPhone,
corporate stock buybacks.
So, by
does
the way,
the
I agree
iPhone
with a
get
lot of
better
that, and
every
one of the
single
things
year?
that has generated that
Is
is
the Fed.
Because it doesn't need to.
The Fed is a disaster
Yep.
area.
Totally agree on that.
The massive infusion of tremendous amounts of money and easy credit into the system has
Definitely.
led to people doing exactly that. You are 100% right about that. That is true.
And we're also seeing that happen within the housing market where you have private equity firms who have taken interest-free money, cheap money, thanks to the Federal Reserve. They're just buying up entire neighborhoods of single-family homes that typically would be purchased by actual families.
Again, agree. The Federal Reserve is expending extraordinary resources, and their easy money policies over the course of the last 2 decades have been an absolute disaster for the American economy.
And quantitative easing, honestly, started under the Obama administration. So the fury that middle America feels toward Democrats like Obama, I get it. Because after you just got foreclosed on, after all of that heartache that your family experienced in the 2008 economic crash, you see the banks, you see Wall Street, you see the same individuals literally exploit that crisis to become even wealthier.
Right, and here's where I think this has always been sort of the fascinating divide when it came to, for example, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. So my question always with Occupy Wall Street, which is making some of the same points you're making, is why are you occupying Wall Street? Why aren't you occupying K Street? Like you should be in Washington. I don't understand why you're going after the people. Again, speaking of incentive structures, the people in Wall Street are acting based on an incentive structure. That incentive structure is created by the easy money, which is actually being generated by the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve. One of those things is a thing where you have stock in it. It's called your vote. And one of those things is a place you do not have stock in it, and that's called Wall Street, unless you actually have stock in the company, in which case you go to the shareholder meeting. So it seems to me that the focus should be placed on the origin of the public policy. If you and I can agree that the Federal Reserve should stop pumping money into the economy, and this will naturally lower the amount of easy money that is available for all of these places to buy up all of the single-family homes in Houston, for example, then I think we actually hit agreement. I think where we hit the disagreement is where you say, okay, we need to penalize these companies for buying up the single-family homes.
No.
When I really don't think that that's really the issue.
Well, no, we need to do away with the ability for them to get that easy money and buy up the single-family homes. And honestly, one of the biggest issues, I think part of the reason why, or the main reason why the Obama administration went along with this whole quantitative easing policy is because whether you're talking about Democrats or Republicans, both parties have been captured by those corporate interests, thanks to unlimited campaign donations into political action committees, thanks to the fact that our politicians can be personally invested in individual stocks. We need to reform the system. It's not necessarily about punishing Wall Street. It's about getting to the root of the problem, which is the corrupt influence that Wall Street has on our politicians, thanks to how this system is set up.
I don't disagree with any of that particularly, but I would say that there's one additional element that I actually think looms far larger, and that is the political interest in Washington is always going to be in control, and Keynesian economics suggests that the easiest way to avoid blowback for a stagnating economy is to pump money into it. And so if you are in Washington, you're never going to be the president who says, we need to radically increase the interest rates. Right? The interest rates are not meeting with what the actual risk level is in American society. Right now, Biden's taking the heat for it. The reality is that the notion that the Federal Reserve, every president is going to have an interest in pumping money into the system. The more money you pump into the system, the more you inflate the GDP. The more you inflate the GDP, the more people have the impression that things are going splendidly.
True.
The more easy money there is in the system, the more that you do have corporate interests who are backing.
You mean so the incentive structure under capitalism? Constant growth? Like at the center of capitalism is always going to be the profit margin. That's why, again, when we talk about systems, rethinking the way the system's organized, rethinking what your incentives are is super key.
All of that's true, but that starts with the amount of control that can be exercised by Washington, which is why, and this is where we'll disagree, I think that Washington should be stripped and castrated, and most of its power should be taken away. And then we don't have to worry about any of this. And all the stuff you want to do at the local level, you can do with your friends. And what I don't want to do at the local level, I can do with my friends. Anna, thank you so much for stopping by. It's really been a pleasure, and hope we can do it again in the future.
Thank you. I really appreciated it and enjoyed it.
That was a lot of fun.
What nice little music. Okay, well, yeah. I don't really have a whole lot to say. We're over time, so I'm gonna make this really quick. Overall, Anna did pretty amazing, honestly. Really did a good job advocating and I think pushing forward her positive values and positive what's the word I'm looking for? Her overall, I think, like positive prescriptive policy positions, right? So Ben, I'm glad that they kind of did this talk, but I do think I think that Ben did a good enough job like defending his points, but I hope that Anna does more of these on more than just like Ben Shapiro's channel. Obviously not with people, like some people are just kind of bad faith and not really worth the conversation, but I do think that that was really positive, really good. Anna did a great job. I mean, they're gonna disagree on a bunch of stuff, but I really enjoyed that. It was, Ben, for the most part, I think had to come at it from a very, very good faith, angle for the most part. Granted, he's not on the same show where he gets to kind of not get challenged on stuff. He knows that he's going to get pushback for certain things, but I do think Anna did a really good job there, pushing back where she needed to and forwarding her vision for the country. But yeah, the thing that they tell, like at the end of all YouTube videos where they tell you to like click on one of these like things to watch more videos. Yeah, I've been meaning to film one of those. So that's what I was doing. I was just setting it up to